Hi, welcome to How Literature Can Save the World, where we explore the written word's impact on our culture and our relationships with ourselves, each other, and the environment. I'm your host, Michelle R. Brady. Grab a drink or a blanket or an animal to pet, and let's begin to make our lives more meaningful, one book at a time.
The trouble that mankind makes is that he thinks he's Italian, he's German, he's Spanish. We're all humans on this beautiful paradise is our earth.
Okay, so today we have Adrian Bonenberger, and I am going to start this off by saying that this is the bio he sent me, and you will see when you compare it to the one that I wrote for him exactly the kind of humble person he is. So here's his. Adrian is a combat veteran of Afghanistan and participated in Ukraine's war of defense against Russia. He's written 2 books, edited another that is part of a lawsuit against Anthropic, and written hundreds of articles, essays, and stories about national security and veterans affairs. So here's mine after research on the internet and what I know about him. And then Adrian will, of course, correct all of my mistakes when I'm done. But here's mine. Adrian is a writer and a journalist. He is also indeed a combat vet with service in Afghanistan with the 173rd Airborne and again with 10th Mountain. His undergrad was at Yale, and he earned a master's in journalism at Columbia and an MFA at Stony Brook. He founded Rathbearing Tree, a literary journal, spent time training Ukrainian troops during the Russia invasion, ran for and was elected to public office in his home state, and is always finding ways to fight for causes that he believes in. And he's published countless articles and several books on the same, which will be in the show notes. Okay, so fill me in what I missed or said incorrectly.
No, that's right. You got that right. Um, yeah, I've led a peripatetic life, and I listened to your first um episode, the introductory episode, and I was interested to learn that you come from a background of poverty. I grew up poor, which is not to say impoverished, because I think a characteristic of poverty is that you never fully escape from it, and it's sort of it's all encompassing, and it defines how you think about things. My dad was a classical guitarist, my mom was a poet, but we were surrounded by people who did have money, and it never, like, when you're a kid, you don't really, when you see the people around you, you assume that the opportunities that are available to them are available to you, even if that isn't true. So I did not grow up in poverty. I always felt that, money was one of those things that you had or you didn't have. And I think the word for that, you know, the word for that is probably privilege. It's a privilege, not to think that money is a constraining characteristic of one's life, that it needs to be gotten at all costs. And as a result of that, I don't have a lot of retirement savings, as much as I should, certainly. But I have a lot of wonderful experiences, and I am addicted to writing. So I spend a lot of time writing essays or writing stories or reading. I should probably be doing other things. I'm sure my friends and my family would like it if I were doing things that brought me in more money. But going to war, helping other countries, helping my fellow veterans with a space to publish are all outgrowths of that feeling I have, which is, I want to do this thing, so I'm going to do it.
I totally hear what you're saying. I think that the thing that is most interesting to me is the idea that money should be, the result of all of this work. And in reality, it's such a small gain. I mean, as long as you can eat and you can help the causes that you care about, I think that the bigger thing that you're doing is helping everyone else, and everything that you write, somebody's reading it. Somebody is reading it for the first time and somebody's mind has changed. And maybe it's not everybody, but it's probably at least one person. And we have no idea what the impacts of that will be down the line. But I hear what you're saying. It would be nice to also be able to afford things and, be able to support your kids and send them to college or whatever else you want to do. And also, just to say something about your definition of poverty, that's really interesting to me. I've never thought of it that way. And I was actually speaking with my husband earlier about how I kind of outed myself on that intro and talked about, my upbringing. And I've never thought about myself as growing up in poverty until recently. And so I thought that it might be easier just to call it for what I think it is. But I do think that there's some truth to what you're saying about, once you label something, then it kind of follows you around and it has a shadow over you. But that's really interesting. Okay, but I have so many things to ask you, and I don't even know how to put the ball together. I think I want to start with the article you wrote, or I guess it's sort of an essay in Rathbearing Tree about moral injury. And it really was quite an interesting take on the subject and something that I think a lot of people don't know about in general. But um, it's like feeling ashamed for things you're forced to do or things that you see and you're complicit in or you feel like you're complicit in. And I was hoping that you might, I know I didn't really prep you for this, but I was hoping you might talk a little bit about your viewpoint as at least expressed in this essay, if you wouldn't mind, or your thoughts on it generally.
Yeah, happy to. The essay on moral injury, which is also sort of an essay about betrayal and different forms of betrayal.
Yeah.
It's about people going into the military, and and I think this is a very we know this story from Vietnam too. You see this in a lot of the Vietnam movies. People joining idealistically because their fathers had been in World War II, and then going to Vietnam and not having the World War II experience and feeling not just cheated, but betrayed by the government,
Yeah.
probably with some cause, honestly. If the government was complicit in selling Vietnam as a World War II, then the government was lying. And I think a lot of conspiracy theories that we have today probably come from that. Well, now when we went into Iraq and Afghanistan, we were the kids of the Vietnam generation, and we already had that template of betrayal, with us. Even so, I think, there was a lot of propaganda and narratives around Iraq and Afghanistan being good wars.
Mhm.
And so I think both because intellectuals and creative types tend to be idealistic, those and they also write those creative types and idealists who went into Iraq or Afghanistan thinking that they were going into something better than Vietnam, where they were going to do it right, were disabused very quickly, and that's where that idea of moral injury comes about in the essay.
Mhm.
It's people who are idealistic and optimistic are, I think, the ones who are also most prone to writing. And so most of the writing and the movies and the stories that you see about Iraq and Afghanistan are that it was this awful betrayal. Their experience of it was bad, and the government lied. But that's not most people who went to Iraq and Afghanistan, I don't think. I mean, I don't know about how you feel, about the people that you went over with, and the soldiers, and the airmen that. Me personally, I would say, 80% of the infantrymen, that I deployed with on my first and second deployment, they felt that we did our mission. It wasn't pleasant physically, but they got some sense of, meaning out of it. They don't feel that the government betrayed them. They feel that they knew pretty much what they were getting into. And it's actually the intellectual and creative description of Iraq and Afghanistan that don't ring true to them. So that becomes the betrayal. So I was interested in interrogating moral injury because I think, I think we get it wrong as a country. I think we get it wrong when we go into a place like Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan and say, it's going to be great. This is going to be fine. These people love us and we're going to make everything better. And we also get it wrong when we say, actually, it was horrible. Everybody hated it, because that's not true either. And I just wanted to introduce a little bit of complexity into our understanding of war.
Yeah, man, that was really interesting. We are kind of getting a tiny bit off topic here, but I mean, it's kind of on topic too because, what I want to transition to is your role. And I know that, your spouse is Ukrainian. I don't know if you feel comfortable talking about any of these things, but I would be curious to know about the work you did before you left for Ukraine. The work you did here, writing and publishing and trying to convince people in a way that was less, I guess, physical, like your physical blood, sweat, and tears into the fight yourself, and how you felt those efforts went, and if you felt like your boots on the ground in Ukraine made more of a difference than your words, or how you felt like those two things supported each other. I'm curious about.
That's another great question, and I think it also gets gets at the heart of what this podcast is about, which is the utility of literature and reading and writing and thinking in the world. And I don't, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I suppose I probably would have felt a little bit more optimistic about things. Um, but and I don't feel pessimistic per se. I don't feel that there's no point or I had no influence because I can see the influence because people have read the things that I wrote and I feel in some way, and I've talked to other folks who have been on the Ukraine beat since 2014 or 2015, early hands, old hands, people who saw what this was going to be a while ago, and I'm talking about Westerners here, Americans, British, Germans, and the consensus is that had nobody really said anything about it, it's likely that or possible that Ukraine things would have gone in Ukraine the way that they have so many times before for Ukraine. That if there hadn't been so much attention, or just dedicated attention, not on my part, but my part and dozens of people like me writing in 2015 and 2016 and 2017 and 18 and just continuing to bang the drum that it would have been a lot easier for the West to just turn its back on Ukraine. And the West has turned its back on Ukraine, a half a dozen times over the last 400 or 500 years, or seen it as a means to an end,
Mhm.
as a way to get something, diplomatically or selfishly. And the people who cared about Ukraine, myself included, I fell in love with the country, and then I met my wife, and I fell in love with my wife, and she's an American citizen, but she's a Ukrainian patriot, and a true believer in democracy, and a fierce opponent of corruption and opacity in government. And I think that that energy that we poured into it, I guess I don't feel as optimistic as I could because at the same time that I was writing, you know, in November of 2021, all you need to do is give these folks, the weapons and equipment that they need to be ready, and Russia's not going to be able to take this place. And at the same time, you had people with far more credibility than I do, like Sam Charop of Rand Corporation, saying, "Look, it's not going to make any difference. You shouldn't arm Ukraine because it's a waste of time and money." And and I don't know. I guess the point, maybe the point there is that if you believe something and you're convinced that you are idealistic and not pessimistic and not a quote realist unquote, that you should just commit to the thing. And yeah, so I wrote a lot of essays, urging America to give more, to be more engaged, um, to secure Ukraine, to bring them into a defensive alliance or NATO. And I think that maybe part of that is that infantry warrior mentality. Part of it is idealism. Part of it is going to a place like Ukraine and walking around there and feeling like the people, not that not that they deserve to be helped and the Afghans didn't deserve to be helped,
Right.
but that they were ready and eager to be helped. And the Afghans were always sort of on the fence between the government and the Taliban. That's what I saw.
Yeah,
And many
that's what I
tribal elders told me this, and dozens of meetings over tea. And ultimately that was the calculus that they did in 2021. It's not that Afghanistan fell so much as that it was never really ours to begin with. Whereas Ukraine, just about every Ukrainian I talked to, whether they were, far left, communist, socialist, anarchist, or far right nationalist, everyone was like, "Yeah, we disagree about that stuff, but we agree about one thing, and that's fuck Russia, and we want them out of our country." They're all on the same page. So I poured a lot of sweat, and wrote a lot of words about that, and feel kind of wore out from it, honestly. I'm working on a memoir about it too, and it's hard to write because it just like it hurts to write it, but I hope it'll be finished at some point.
Yeah, I understand about it hurting to write about things. I almost feel like that's a really clear indication that it needs to be written. I mean, it's kind of painful to say that, right? Like, the things that pain you the most, those are the things that you need to do because that's what other people need to hear, and because I think that it ends up being the most true. And people can tell, right? Like, And to your point about the, gentleman from Rand, I don't remember his name, but, I almost wonder if it's not really competing arguments, it's more like competing platforms. How do you compete with someone who has a built-in audience and, the backing of an organization if you're just one person? And I know that you also formed, maybe a nonprofit. I'm not really quite sure. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit. Um in support of Ukraine, and was that sort of an attempt to build more of a coalition? And did it work out? And am I making this up, or I think I read this somewhere.
No, you're right. You're right. I with some other folks, I co-founded a a nonprofit that's still around. It's called Citizens to Soldiers, and it was actually a response to interest rather than an attempt to articulate a vision and the outgrowth of my experience of training civilians
Ah,
in Ukraine. I learned a great deal about that process, and was also able to reflect on my service in the U.S. military. I mean, as having been in the military, I think you were both enlisted and an officer. I correct me if I'm wrong there.
no, that's right.
So you know that like most of what an officer actually does is just training. It's actually, you're putting together training plans. You're not actually like inspiring people,
Oh, I
leading
inspired people,
people.
Adrian.
Oh, definitely.
No,
Yeah.
I'm just kidding, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, but 90% of what you do is inspiring people to like, you know, work out harder,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
take the training seriously and accomplish the mental tasks. Uh, Um, and so, a lot of what I did as an officer in Afghanistan, a lot of what we did was training Afghans. And so when I went to Ukraine, I was just stunned at how quickly the Ukrainians soaked that up. And it was me and a former Cav officer with the deployment to Iraq, Matt Gallagher, another writer, and then Ben Bush, another writer. And he was a Marine Corps reconnaissance officer because he was a lieutenant colonel. And so we went over there and we did this training. It was about 2 weeks, and it was sort of a mishmash of Marine Corps training and Army Ranger training, Ranger school training specifically. I don't mean to suggest I wasn't a ranger. I went to ranger school. Um, and, and they just they soaked it up. And I think for a number of reasons. Firstly, because they were motivated, because we thought that the Russians were gonna be where we were in a matter of, weeks, maybe even days. And also because a lot of them were a bit older, and I had this real moment of insight that, an educated democratic population of people who have agency and are used to having sort of responsibility and autonomy and authority,
Mhm.
in their personal lives uh, can really pick up a lot of what took us, weeks or months to learn when we were in the military. And younger people, we think of folks in the military as being 18, to 24, 25, which is the draft age. So it was like the fastest and most, effective training that I'd ever been a part of. And so a lot of other people started coming over. Citizens to Soldiers was just a way to organize those people. Um, and we were hoping to send more people over, but our model was, unfortunately, and is just sort of was volunteers. We were hoping to raise a lot of money and just send people over, but people who were like professionals, veterans, who were taking a break, not pay anybody. And it was not a well-conceived nonprofit. Now what we do is we talk, we podcast
Ooh.
us, and talk about mobilization and training, hoping to take some of the lessons that we've learned both in the military, and also over in Ukraine and apply them here to the United States at a local level.
Well, that still sounds quite amazing. I love how you make it sound like something failed at some point, and it's more amazing than anything I've done in my whole life. It's kind of it's just this is just your brand, just so you know. Like, you might not believe this, and I don't know you that well, but I know that this is your brand. And I want to just say quickly before we pivot into like the main event, that one of the things I really loved about the essay that you wrote in Raspberry Tree, is the nuance and the competing points of view. You're not trying to sell something. It feels like you're really exploring a concept and really getting into both sides and digging down deep. And that's the kind of writing that we need more of. More like, you can take from this what you want." here are some ideas, and I just wanted to mention that before I move on, but, I do wanna move on because when you were saying earlier, I'm just gonna just rewind us to childhood really quick, about growing up, you know, poor, not in poverty, but poor. It reminded me a lot of Malcolm Gladwell's book, David and Goliath, because that was the first time I really ever thought of my childhood as being better than other people's childhoods in a way that it prepared me more for life. And I recommend this book. I know that people have feelings one way or the other about Malcolm Gladwell, but this book really helped me own a lot of parts of myself, and I stopped feeling like, um, had I had a better family or money or whatever, if I had more opportunities, maybe I could have done even more, and I realized that it was the lack of those opportunities that gave me everything I have, and I now wonder how I'm going to raise my kids in a way that takes away some of their privilege so that they have the chance to learn the things they need to learn to be good people and to be resilient and tenacious and um, to strive and to not just quit the second things get tough. And I wanted to use that, sort of anecdote, I guess, to pivot back into your childhood and what books, and poetry, essays, all of the things that you read helped make you you. And go.
Yeah, I love that pivot and I love that observation. I've got a newborn daughter. She's creeping up on 3 months now, and I'm the stepfather to a young man. He's 21 and he's a senior in college. Um, and sort of between those two experiences, like exactly like you're saying, like you think to yourself about, I mean, would I trade growing up hungry sometimes? And like, I read this book about the biography of Jackie Robinson when I was, I think, in like 6th or 7th grade. And there's this part in this biography where Jackie Robinson talks about how he would take uh, a cup of water and a slice of bread, and he would imagine the water was Coca-Cola and the bread was a hamburger. And I used that trick,
Yeah.
because there were times where I was like, I just got water, I just got bread. Like, imagine if, and I was using that in Ranger School sometimes, or
Oh, yeah.
Afghanistan. I was like,
It's a practical thing.
yeah, totally. And you want your kids to have a minimum of friction possible. You want them mostly, what I pray for is good health for my kids, just good health and long life, like many decades of good health and happiness. And I think you're right that it's like, what can you do to help your kids get the good stuff while minimizing the bad stuff? And you know, there's so many things that you can buy these days that reduce friction. I think the most conspicuous of which being smartphones
Yep.
and access to the internet and social media. So part of the thing I'm thinking is like maybe just trying to find a way to keep a smartphone out of my daughter's hands until she's like 12 or 13 years old. I mean, because otherwise it's like you grow up different if you've got unmitigated and unlimited access to everything. But so for me, I went to this very precocious Montessori school when I was a kid. Or my mother's family had a bit of money, and so they paid for this sort of private prep school, this Montessori school. And so the first like series of books that I remember having a big impact on me was the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and I read it between the 2nd and the 3rd grade, which
Oh my
sounds
gosh.
just like insane, but you have to remember I had like a ton of time on my hands and like, no TV. Um, and we lived in this weird little place on the shore in Connecticut. So it was like me running around outside or me inside, like reading these books, and then I read the Iliad and the Odyssey between 3rd and 4th grade. And I think those 2 works, I put a lot of time into reading them. It took me a while to read them. 2nd and 4th grade, that was it. And that, probably locked in both, my ideas about good and evil and the importance of being good and also maybe the importance of honor, and the possibility of, accessing honor or or divinity or the divine through battle, which is
Yeah.
a constant theme in the Iliad. Uh, Virtue, what is the purpose of a person? So those were hugely influential. And then at the same time, I was reading Shel Silverstein, The Wind in the Willows, The Golden Book of Poetry. I think those are the primary influences on me, and while I was a kid.
Well, that's kind of incredible. But I do think that when you're introduced to those themes so early, they're kind of more formative, and maybe you don't understand everything you're reading, or at least some of the deeper themes. Some of it's pretty obvious, so I can imagine that you did get like very much out of it. But then when you read it later, you have access to all the different layers that the books have. I don't know which would be more influential in somebody's life. Okay, what about adult Adrian? What books do you have for us?
Yeah, well, so to get to adult Adrian, you go through. So there's childhood Adrian, and then as a kid, I spent a ton of time reading like horror and like pulp science fiction, and
You took quite a turn.
it was a huge turn. It was really whatever was around in the
Yeah.
local library. My parents had a lot of books, but it was also just like I read all of Stephen King, Peter Straub, Lovecraft, Terry Brooks, Madeline L'Engle, Piers Anthony, who I recently learned is still alive. Surprisingly, he's in his 90s. But
I've read Piers Anthony. I remember that. They're like funny, right? I remember
yeah,
them being like
it is.
satirical.
Yes. Yes. Very tongue-in-cheek, sardonic, lots of
Mhm.
puns, and very witty. And it's weird because to prepare for this podcast, it might surprise people hearing me sort of ramble and interrupt myself with ums and ahs that I prepared at all. That may be shocking to learn. And I was thinking about the sort of things that I really enjoyed reading when I was an adult. And it's, I Hemingway, Hardy, especially Hardy's later stuff like Jude the Obscure, Virginia Woolf, Raymond Carver, Dennis Johnson, Dos Passos, David Foster Wallace. But I was looking at these, and it feels like they're all kind of depressing and like surrealistic. Like Hemingway has this reputation as being like a realist, and Dos Passos does as well. But there's so many unbelievable things that happen in Hemingway, and when you have life experience, the first time I read Hemingway was A Farewell to Arms. I was
Mhm.
18, because you've never been through childbirth. You don't understand that the way he describes childbirth is like all wrong. That's not how people have kids. Like he must have been imagining that or something. Like there's a lot of surrealist stuff in there.
That's funny. That's really good.
Yeah, so these are for an author to make the list. I made sure that I had read a book of theirs at least twice. And in the case of Raymond Carver, I've read his short fiction collections, I don't know, maybe a half a dozen times.
Yeah.
And there are other writers that are like Carver or Dennis Johnson, whom I've also read.
Mhm.
But there's something about but I have noticed that it's a lot easier for me to follow writers. I should have mentioned Vonnegut as well.
Yeah.
Writers who write accessibly and briefly.
Me too.
Their prose is plain or short fiction. So like Hemingway's novels, I can handle, but my attention wanders. Hardy's novels, I can handle, but my attention wanders. But Carver and Johnson, they're short fiction. Didion, David Foster Wallace. It's that sweet spot for length.
Yeah.
Um, and it's also, it feels, maybe because I got my start reading things that were fantastical and metaphorical,
Right.
things that were standing in for other things. So the Lord of the Rings is a metaphor maybe for World War I or World War II, or the struggle between good and evil. And realists don't do a great job with that, because realists, present plausible scenarios, and then you're asked as the reader to provide that good or evil. And you say like, well, the husband did this and his friend did that. What do you think of it? And I tend not to love that fiction
Yeah.
for the most part, because I'm sort of like, if I want to read a story like that, I could live that. I'll just go to a party and, I'm going to have an odd or upsetting conversation with somebody if I talk to enough people. But I can't see a dragon,
Yeah.
because they're not real. whether it's being used metaphorically to describe a battle between good and evil, or as certain fantasy or science fiction authors do, just as sort of a big animal. So I don't know. I've been writing a lot of horror lately. I've been writing horror and I, surrealist literature.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, of course, the memoir to sort of I write that to take a break from writing the memoir, which is just exhausting emotionally and physically. Um, and depressing because
Yeah.
I should have mentioned this, I suppose, but, I actually feel pretty badly about how I part of me wishes that I'd stayed over there in Ukraine, training with those folks or maybe even joining the Ukrainian military, and I have so much respect for the people who did that. It feels sort of sometimes like coming back was a betrayal, but coming back, it was an awful choice because it was betray my wife,
Right.
by staying there or betray the Ukrainian military, and I'm not Ukrainian, and so, when I thought about it, I was like, "Well, I'm not gonna betray my wife. I've made a promise to her." That's a scurrilous and dishonorable thing to even consider, so I never seriously considered it, but anytime I look over at Ukraine and what's going on there, I know to myself at the same time, I know that staying there would have been the right thing to do. Um, so that's the problem that I'm wrestling with in this memoir is that like how do you write an upbeat or inspiring nonfiction piece when you yourself don't feel necessarily upbeat or inspired about what you did?
You know, I think what you have to do, I mean, no, you're not actually asking me, this is more rhetorical, but I think what you have to do is just write what you just said, like, of course you feel some guilt, and that just makes you, I mean, it just comes across as you've already done more than most people, and you cannot be expected to give up the rest of your life. You just can't, and there are so many causes and so many things that we all need to fight for, and we need to be alive to fight them, and part of that is your family, and part of that is your country, which is having some hard times right now. So I think, it's admirable that you're beating yourself up about this, but I can't imagine making a different choice. I think that you are doing the right thing and you did the right thing by going because you were, you know, impassioned to do it and you did. And there's only so much you can do. You can't do everything. Yeah, but I mean, if you just write things truthfully like you always do, I can't imagine not coming to the conclusion at the end of your book that you feel better about your decision. Like it doesn't really matter how it's received by other people. It matters how you write through your regret and your pain and how you feel at the end of it. And I think that's the whole point of writing, really. It's not really for other people, it's just for us. I don't know if that's at all helpful. Probably not, but my 2 cents.
No, it absolutely is, and I agree with you. I'm teaching a class right now in Springfield College, introductory college writing. I've got this silly sort of formula for being the best writer that I can be, which is being the best human that I can be. It's called the Iron Triangle of Mastery, and it's do, study, teach. Uh, and that really works for me. I know some people who don't need to teach and don't need to study. They're so insanely talented as writers that they can just kind of rip. They just, in fact, some of them probably shouldn't teach. You stay in the classroom, not good, not very charismatic, and do have problematic ideas about things. But and one of the things that I tell the students is I tell them you have to, when you're writing an essay or when you're writing a piece, you should have, your audience in mind. And it does feel a little bit like I'm lying to them because I completely agree with you. Like most of the time, I'm really just writing for myself, and if it makes me laugh, then I feel like it's funny, and if it delights me, if I'm delighted by it, I feel that it's correct and it's good, and you have to trust that. I agree with you, and I appreciate your counsel too. It's writers, we're constantly we're like, Shackleton, in that boat between Antarctica and that's there's clouds overhead and you're constantly just looking for the sun to take a reading and make sure that you're on course, and your counsel is wise and appreciated.
Well, I really appreciate that. I know we are running out of time. Man, I have so many things I want to talk to you about. But one of the things I wanted to say earlier, I guess there's two things. I don't I don't want to make you get into something if you don't have time. Well, when I was a kid, I thought the highest form of writing was allegorical fiction. To your point about metaphors, just something that's a stand-in for something else, and especially when it came to philosophy like Camus and it didn't really matter necessarily what the philosophy was, but the idea that it could be embodied in fiction, like, fascinated me, and I thought that it was really incredible, and I think that's more to your point about, a story can just be a story, but why? Why when it could be so much more than just a story? And if it's just a story, then wouldn't it maybe be better as a TV show? Or there's other formats for it to just do that. And then my second point was about Dennis Johnson and Jesus' son. And I was thinking as you were talking about some of the short story collections and shorter works, that I wonder if I'm just coming to this now. I wonder if every writer has like one or two the real thing, the heart of what they want to say with everything they've done in their lives and everything they've read and all of the things they've assimilated. And this is the one message they want to send out. And maybe they don't know what that is necessarily, but as you read through all of their collected works, you can see the thing, like you can see threads of it in other places. Like look at The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. They're essentially the same book, except for one is a little more fleshed out, but it's the same thing. And I wonder if writers have the one thing that they will be known for forever, or if we are really capable of coming up with a lot of different ideas. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or if I'm just meandering.
No, it's a great observation and question, and it's something that I think every writer probably thinks about at some point. If they think of themselves as a writer, they think about it at some point. What am I trying to do here? What
Yeah.
am I saying? Because again, if you're writing for yourself, you're whether you're conscious of it or not, what the motivation is when it's once it's spilled out onto the page and you're going through and you're editing it, you then have the perspective or the ability to step back and say, okay, so I did this, for better or for worse, I did this, and what does that say about me? I think the most compelling writers, and I'm saying most compelling rather than best writers because some people would disagree with best, but certainly for me, the most compelling writers are writers that do like Hemingway. Best, I think, pretty famously. You're talking about Rand writing the same novel again. Hemingway's got The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms and For Whom the Bell Tolls, and they
Yeah.
feel very similar. And the sort of the most famous short fiction of his could in some senses, if they feel like scratch chapters in any one of those books. It's like a rich guy goes here, shacks up with rich chick, or like adventurer goes and shacks up with some rich chick and then spurns her and is brave. Or Hardy, Hardy takes such a dark turn. Jude the Obscure, got it sitting in front of me right now. It's like that book when I read it, I think junior year high school, or just like shattered me. Um, just absolutely shattered me. But he got real pessimistic at about the same time Mark Twain did. I stumbled into a short story by Twain's, which is in this curious tradition of which Twain, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Stephen King. The short story is a kid is going down the street or going down the trail or whatever and encounters Satan and how that plays out. And it's an allegory, like
Mhm.
you're saying. How do you present the problem of man, the problem of humans, and it's an encounter with Satan. It's an encounter with a, a, a very clever person or thing who's capable of saying anything to get you to do something that you shouldn't do.
Yeah.
And Hardy, is writing Jude the Obscure and Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and Tess of the D'Urbervilles is sort of like that. In this case, the satanic figure would be her cousin who rapes her and impregnates her and scandalizes her, and so she ends up dying, but she gives birth to this kid who her sister takes up. But it seems that there was this moment in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, where people were coming to the end of colonialism and really like felt like they'd reached some kind of civilizational dry hole, like they were at the end of it, and everybody was getting really depressed about stuff. Then World War I happened. Um, I mean, what is literature good for is, in some senses, like much more than, much more than movies or TV shows or even video games where you see the thing that's happening. Like you watch Lord of the Rings and you see a dragon. You know what the dragon looks like.
Yeah.
But if you're just reading the book, you have to assemble it from the words that have been given to you, which stand in for experiences that you've had. So if it's a snake, if a dragon looks like a snake, then me growing up in Connecticut, I think of a garter snake because that's the type of snake that I see.
Yeah, it looked like your snake. Yeah, yeah.
Right? So a dragon's going to be really slender and probably like black colored. I know basically how it moves, but that's going to be real different from somebody who's seen a rattlesnake or a copperhead. And I think that's a very important, process for thinking. I think metaphor is probably how we think all the time, whether we know that that's how we're thinking or not. I think with writing, it's surrealism and metaphor to me feel like the the most sensible those are the best ways that I can understand things happening. Just about everybody that I read, even the realists,
Mm.
have some sort of surrealist angle that makes it easier for me to put myself in there and not feel like there's nowhere in the story for me.
Yeah.
When I read stories like that, I'll actually just stop reading if I feel that there's nowhere in there for me as a reader.
I know we have to go here, but what you just said made me really think about the idea of not describing things as much. I certainly am not somebody who describes like what clothes people are wearing, or I don't even like to describe what they look like for the most part. And I think that's because I don't want to take that away from people. I want them to imagine whatever they want. Like here is a person with these, emotional or mental characteristics, and you can see him or her however you want to. A book is so much cheaper and easier to produce than a movie. It requires so many fewer people. It's one person's idea, with all the editing and all of the people involved in making it come into fruition. But a movie has so many more people, so much more money, so much more time and effort, and only to create something that's lesser than whatever it came from because it's taking away, the audience's agency in in making it whatever it is that they need it to be and having people speak in a certain way that you can't unsee. I thought that was a really interesting point.
Yeah, so one last point on that, and so obviously I agree with you about that. I'm not disparaging movies or TV, both of which I like. But I love what you had to say about what gets unsaid. And one of my favorite pieces of literature, um, my first exposure to it was probably in the Iliad. It's the lacunae, it's the
Mhm,
space.
mhm.
What literally what gets unsaid, what goes
Yeah,
unsaid. And
yeah.
and Telemachus goes out to find Odysseus and he's sort of going around and he goes to see Menelaus and a heavily narcotized um or
Yeah.
drunk. So Helen of Troy, like, comes back and she's Menelaus's queen again. Like, he got her back. We know this because we know the end of the Iliad. And they're like, "Yeah, we haven't seen your dad. Good luck." He keeps going, and they don't really talk about the other stuff that happens to him. He's just sort of out there going, and then he isn't able to find his father. And so you understand from that experience, like, basically what Telemachus's journey was like. That's the first time I encountered a lacunae, but my favorite lacunae in all of literature, the space that goes unsaid, is in For Whom the Bell Tolls by Hemingway. And it's near the end of the book. And the Hemingway stand-in character, the brave womanizer, I think named Robert Jordan, and he's this guy's like dashing engineer. So he knows how to like dynamite stuff. So he's there to blow up a bridge, a fascist bridge. And he's talking with the head of this Spanish partisan group, who's a woman. Her name is Pilar. And they're talking about this, that, and the other. And they start talking about um, uh, Pilar brings up the idea of the worst day that she ever had. And so she says, "I'll tell you about the worst day that I ever had." She says, it was a couple days after the town, in the very beginning of the war, our town declared for the Republic. And so they're I don't know if they're anarchists or socialists, but they're on the Republican side. They're fighting against the fascists. She said, the town decided to execute the 20 most prominent fascists in the town, fascist sympathizers. And so she describes each one of them, and they get harder and harder. And it's like 20 or 25 pages of like increasingly like they make the first one person run the gauntlet, and he gets, beaten to death and then thrown off this cliff, but like beaten with like sticks or something. And everybody's kind of cool with it. But by the time she gets to the 20th person, the 20th and the last person is the priest. And by this time, the town's like had it. They're like, okay, we just killed 19 people and we don't want to kill the priest. Even if the priest is like a fascist sympathizer, we're not going to kill the priest. And so there's this huge fight in the town itself over whether or not they're going to kill the priest. And the priest is brought into like the pub, and people are trying to protect the priest, but the other people with sticks like drag him out. They beat him to death with their fists. And it's this really, really horrible scene. It's just awful. And so Pilar gets to the end of this story and she says, but that's not the worst day I ever had. And the Hemingway character is like, what's the worst day you ever had? And then Pilar says, the worst day I ever had was 2 days later, the fascists retook the town. But that is a story for another day.
Yeah.
As soon as I read that, like I flipped to the end of the book. I was like, I got to read that story. Like,
Yeah.
that's got to be 100 times worse than, because you already know, you just read 20 to 25 pages of like really awful stuff. It's nowhere. Hemingway wisely does not write that story because that lacuna, he's already written it for you.
Right.
All you need to know is those 20 or 25 pages, comma, worse.
Yeah.
That is the worst.
Man, what a great point. I have never known what that term was. It's really, really fun to learn these things. And I mean, this conversation has been really great. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate your time. I know you're really busy, and I don't necessarily, I do want to add one last thing though, because I have to. I saw when I was doing my research for your real bio, by the way, I saw that you said in some forum for like when you were running for reelection or something, that one of your favorite quotes was, what one man can do, another man can do, or another can do. And I don't know if this is from somewhere else, but I remember that from The Edge, the movie The Edge, when Anthony, I don't know if this is where you got it from or if he got it from somewhere else, but
I did.
you did? Okay, good, because I saw that movie when I was in Iraq, and I remember just, like, thinking that that was the most powerful line ever, and I loved it, and it really helped me get through a lot of things because I would think, "Why can't I do that? Why shouldn't I try that? If this other person can do it, they're no more, human than me." And I was just like, of course, that would be one of your favorite quotes because, like, yes, that's so you. And I just wanted to leave everybody with that. And thank you so much for this whole conversation. It's been really great.
A real pleasure. I've learned a lot from it, and I'm looking forward to keeping up with these podcasts. You're choosing, with the exception of present company, very interesting guests.
Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, and in the words of my daughter,
let's hip hop our way out.